Tony Bennett stood in the wings of Lincoln Center's David Geffen Hall, adjusting his black bow tie one final time as the murmur of 2,738 expectant voices filtered through the curtain. At 97, he had performed on this stage dozens of times, but tonight felt different. There was an electricity in the air, a sense of anticipation that seemed almost supernatural in its intensity. "Mr. Bennett," came a voice from behind him. Tony turned to see a woman in her 40s, impeccably dressed in a dark suit, holding a tablet and wearing an expression of professional seriousness. "I'm Dr. Sarah Chen from the Lincoln Center Administration. I need to speak with you before you go on." Tony's manager, Patricia Williams, stepped forward protectively. "We discussed this already. Mr. Bennett doesn't do interviews or meetings right before a performance. Whatever this is about can wait until after the show." "I'm afraid it can't wait," Dr. Chen said, her voice carrying an urgency that made Tony's stomach tighten with inexplicable dread. "Mr. Bennett, I need you to understand something very important about tonight's performance. You have exactly 100 minutes from the moment you step onto that stage." "100 minutes for what?" Tony asked, confusion evident in his voice. Dr. Chen looked at her tablet, then directly into Tony's eyes. 100 minutes to complete what you came here to do. The countdown begins the moment you take your first step into the spotlight." Patricia stepped between them. "What is this nonsense? Who are you really? I've never seen you before, and I know everyone in Lincoln Center management." "Check your guest list, Ms. Williams," Dr. Chen said calmly. "You'll find that seat A1 has been reserved for someone very important tonight, someone who has been waiting a very long time to hear Mr. Bennett's final performance." Tony felt a chill run through his body. "Final performance? I never announced this as my final performance." "Nevertheless," Dr. Chen continued, "tonight is the night everything comes full circle. You have 100 minutes, Mr. Bennett. Use them wisely." Before either Tony or Patricia could respond, Dr. Chen disappeared into the maze of backstage corridors, leaving them staring after her in bewilderment. "Tony," Patricia said, her voice shaking slightly, "maybe we should postpone tonight's show. Something about this feels wrong." Tony considered her suggestion for a moment, but the sound of the audience beyond the curtain drew him forward. These people had come to hear him sing, some of them traveling from around the world for what many suspected might be one of his last performances. He couldn't disappoint them based on the cryptic warnings of a mysterious woman who might be nothing more than an elaborate prankster. "No," Tony said firmly. "Whatever game she's playing, I won't let her ruin tonight for these people. Let's give them a show they'll never forget." As the orchestra began the opening notes of "I Left My Heart in San Francisco," Tony stepped into the spotlight. The moment his foot crossed the threshold between shadow and light, he heard something that made his blood run cold. The distinct sound of a digital timer beginning its countdown. Tick, tick, tick. The sound was audible only to him, somehow bypassing his ears and resonating directly in his consciousness. And with each tick, he felt something strange happening to his perception of time. The audience seemed to be moving slightly slower than normal, their applause stretching and elongating in a way that suggested time itself was beginning to behave differently. But Tony was a professional. He had performed through illness, through personal tragedy, through technical disasters and hostile crowds. A mysterious countdown and some temporal distortion weren't going to stop him from delivering the performance these people deserved. He began to sing, and his voice filled the hall with a warmth and sophistication that had made him beloved for 7 decades. But as he reached the chorus of his opening number, something alarming happened. The countdown in his head accelerated. What had been a steady tick-tick-tick suddenly became tick, 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 as if his act of singing was somehow speeding up whatever process the countdown was measuring. By the time he finished "I Left My Heart in San Francisco," Tony realized with growing panic that he had somehow lost not just the 4 minutes it had taken to perform the song, but nearly 10 minutes of his allotted 100. The countdown was consuming time faster when he was actively performing. "Ladies and gentlemen," Tony said into the microphone, his voice steady despite his internal turmoil, "tonight is a very special evening for me, and I want to share it with all of you in a way I've never shared before." He paused, trying to understand the rules of whatever game was being played with his life. If singing consumed time faster, perhaps talking would slow the countdown. But, even as he spoke, he could feel precious seconds draining away, though at a slightly slower rate than when he was singing. "I've been performing for nearly 8 decades, Tony continued, desperately trying to buy time while he figured out what was happening to him. "In all that time, I've learned that music isn't just entertainment. It's a conversation between the performer and the audience, a shared experience that transcends the boundaries between strangers." The countdown continued its relentless progression, but Tony noticed something interesting. When he spoke directly to the audience, when he created genuine connection and intimacy, the ticking seemed to slow down slightly. It was as if the countdown was measuring not just time, but the quality and depth of the connection he was making with the people in the hall. "Tonight," Tony said, making eye contact with individuals in the front rows, "I want to tell you about the songs that have shaped my life, the people who inspired them, and the moments when music saved me from myself." He launched into "The Way You Look Tonight," but this time he sang it differently than he had in thousands of previous performances. Instead of simply delivering the lyrics, he sang it as if he were seeing his wife Susan in the audience for the first time, as if the song were a love letter being written in real time. The effect was immediate and profound. The countdown slowed dramatically, and Tony felt a surge of energy that seemed to come from the collective emotional response of the audience. They weren't just listening to a performance, they were witnessing something authentic and vulnerable and irreplaceable. But even as Tony began to understand the rules of his predicament, he realized the terrible arithmetic of his situation. He had started with 100 minutes, but the accelerated consumption of time during his first song, combined with the steady drain even during his talking, meant he now had perhaps 70 minutes remaining. And he had planned a 2-hour concert. He would have to choose, either cut his performance drastically short or risk discovering what happened when the countdown reached 0. "Friends," Tony said, his voice taking on an urgency that the audience interpreted as passion, but which masked his growing desperation, "Tonight, I want to perform for you, not just as Tony Bennett, the entertainer, but as Anthony Benedetto, the human being. Each song I'm going to sing has saved my life in some way, and I want to share those stories with you." The audience leaned forward, sensing that something extraordinary was happening. This wasn't the polished professional performance they had expected. This was something raw and honest and immediate. Tony began, "Fly Me to the Moon," but as he sang, he told them about the night in 1964 when he had been contemplating suicide after a devastating review in the New York Times. How this song, performed in a small club in Philadelphia, had reminded him that music was larger than criticism, larger than any individual performer's fears and insecurities. The countdown slowed further. Tony realized that the timer wasn't just measuring time or even the quality of his performance. It was measuring the authenticity of his connection with the audience and, perhaps more importantly, with himself. As he moved through his repertoire, "I've Got the World on a String," "The Best Is Yet to Come," "For Once in My Life," Tony shared stories that he had never told publicly, about his struggles with addiction in the 1970s, about the night he almost walked away from music forever, about the fans who had written letters that arrived at exactly the moments when he most needed to be reminded why he sang. With each story, each moment of genuine vulnerability, the countdown continued to slow. But it never stopped, even at its slowest pace. Tony could feel his allotted time draining away like sand through an hourglass. When he reached the 40-minute mark of his performance, with perhaps 30 minutes remaining on his countdown, Tony noticed something that made his heart race with a mixture of hope and terror. In seat A1, the seat Dr. Chen had mentioned, sat a figure he hadn't noticed before. It was a woman in her 70s wearing a simple black dress with silver hair and eyes that seemed to hold depths of sorrow and wisdom that Tony recognized but couldn't quite place. She wasn't applauding with the rest of the audience. She was simply sitting, watching, waiting. As Tony began, "Because of You," he found himself singing directly to her. As if the rest of the audience had faded away and this performance had become an intimate conversation between two people who shared some profound but forgotten connection. The woman in seat A1 smiled, and suddenly Tony remembered. Her name was Margaret Torino, and she had been his first serious girlfriend back in 1946 when he was just Anthony Benedetto, a young singer trying to make it in the clubs of New York. They had been deeply in love, planning to marry, dreaming of a life built around music and family. But Margaret had been diagnosed with tuberculosis in 1947. In those days, TB was often a death sentence, particularly for someone from a working-class Italian family who couldn't afford the best medical care. Tony had been faced with a choice: abandon his nascent career to care for Margaret, or pursue his dreams while she fought for her life. He had chosen his career. Margaret had died alone in a sanitarium in upstate New York, while Tony was performing at the Copacabana, establishing the connections and reputation that would eventually make him famous. He had never forgiven himself for that choice, and he had never spoken publicly about the woman whose love and death had shaped every song he had sung since 1947. Now, 76 years later, Margaret sat in the front row of Lincoln Center, looking exactly as she had when she was 23 years old, waiting for him to finish what he had started all those years ago. Tony's voice broke as he sang "Because of You," the song that had launched his career, the song that had been playing on the radio the night Margaret died. For the first time in his life, he sang it not as a love song, but as an apology, a confession, a plea for forgiveness that had been building in his heart for 7 decades. The countdown slowed to almost nothing, as if time itself were holding its breath to hear this long overdue conversation between two souls who had unfinished business. "Margaret," Tony whispered into the microphone, his eyes locked on the woman in seat A1. "I'm sorry I wasn't there. I'm sorry I chose fame over love. I'm sorry I let you die alone." Margaret stood up, and when she spoke, her voice somehow carried throughout the hall without amplification, reaching every person in the audience while remaining intimate and personal. "Anthony," she said, using the name he hadn't heard spoken with love in decades, "I never blamed you for your choice. I wanted you to sing. I wanted your voice to reach the world. My death gave your music the depth and sorrow that made it beautiful. Every song you've sung since 1947 has carried my love with it." Tony was crying openly now, 76 years of guilt and grief pouring out of him in front of 2,138 strangers who had become witnesses to the most important conversation of his life. "But I abandoned you," Tony said. "I chose my career over your life." "You chose to become the man I fell in love with," Margaret replied. I fell in love with a singer, Anthony, not with a man who would sacrifice his gift for duty or fear or even love. I needed you to choose music. It was the only way for our love to become eternal. The countdown in Tony's head had almost stopped, but not quite. There was still something unfinished, something that needed to be resolved before his 100 minutes expired. What happens when the countdown reaches 0? Tony asked, though he already knew the answer. You come with me, Margaret said simply. Your time in this world is finished. You've given everything you had to give. You've sung every song you were meant to sing. Now, it's time to rest. Tony looked out at the audience, at the faces of people who had come to hear him perform, and had instead witnessed something far more profound and personal. He thought about his wife Susan, waiting for him at home. He thought about the albums he might still record, the songs he might still sing, the moments of joy and connection that might still be possible if he chose to continue living. But he also felt the weight of 97 years. The accumulated exhaustion of a lifetime spent giving pieces of his soul to strangers, the relief that would come from finally laying down the burden of entertaining when his voice and his memory were beginning to fail him. Do I have to decide now? Tony asked. Margaret smiled, and for a moment she looked exactly as she had in 1946, young and radiant and full of the future they had planned together. You have until the countdown reaches 0. Maybe 2 minutes, maybe 3. Enough time for one last song. Tony looked at his hands, still steady despite his age, still capable of making music. He looked at the audience, hanging on every word of this surreal and beautiful conclusion to what they had thought would be a simple concert. He thought about the choice between a peaceful ending and an uncertain continuation. Then he walked to the piano at the center of the stage, sat down, and began to play The Way You Look Tonight, not as a performance but as a lullaby for himself, a gentle way to accompany whatever decision he would make when the final notes faded away. As he sang, the countdown in his head slowed to match the rhythm of his heartbeat. Each word of the song became a meditation on beauty, on love, on the way that music could transform even ending into something graceful and meaningful. When Tony reached the final line of the song, he realized that the countdown had stopped completely. Time was no longer moving forward. This moment had become eternal, suspended between choice and consequence, between life and whatever comes after. Margaret was still there in seat A1, but now she wasn't alone. Beside her sat his parents, his brother, his first wife Patricia, and dozens of other people who had shaped his life, and then moved on without him. They weren't beckoning or demanding, they were simply present, ready to welcome him if he chose to join them. Tony finished the song and stood up from the piano. The audience was completely silent, as if they understood that they were witnessing a moment that belonged not to entertainment, but to eternity. Ladies and gentlemen, Tony said into the microphone, his voice clear and strong, thank you for sharing this evening with me. Thank you for letting me tell you stories I've never told anyone. Thank you for witnessing what might be the most honest performance of my life. He paused, looking one more time at Margaret, at the faces of the dead who had come to escort him home, at the living audience who had given him their attention and their love on this strange and wonderful night. I've made my choice, Tony said, though he didn't specify what that choice was. And whatever happens next, I want you to remember that music never really ends. It just changes from one form to another, from one voice to another, from one heart to another. The countdown in Tony's head showed a 0001. Tony Bennett smiled, stepped back from the microphone, and made his decision. The audience erupted in the longest standing ovation in Lincoln Center history, though they would spend the rest of their lives debating exactly what they had witnessed that night and what Tony Bennett's final words had really meant. But in seat A1, Margaret Torino's chair sat empty, as it had throughout the entire performance, waiting for a reunion that might have happened, or might still be waiting to happen, depending on the choice that only Tony Bennett knew for certain. The countdown had ended, but the music played on, somewhere beyond the boundaries of time and decision, where every song ever sung continues to echo in the spaces between heartbeats, waiting for the next voice brave enough to pick up the melody and carry it forward into whatever comes next. But what happened in that final second when the countdown reached 0 and Tony Bennett made his choice would become the subject of countless debates, investigations, and theories that would fascinate music historians for generations to come. Dr. Sarah Chen, the mysterious woman who had warned Tony about the countdown, was never found. Security footage from Lincoln Center showed her arriving at the venue, but no cameras captured her leaving. Her name appeared on no employment records, no guest lists, no identification databases. She had materialized from nowhere to deliver her cryptic warning, then vanished as completely as if she had never existed. More disturbing were the testimonies of the audience members who had witnessed Tony's performance that night. While everyone agreed that something extraordinary had happened, their accounts of the evening varied so dramatically that investigators began to wonder if they had all attended the same concert. Some audience members insisted that Tony had performed for exactly 100 minutes before collapsing on stage and being rushed to a hospital, where he recovered fully and continued touring for another year. Others claimed that he had performed for only 37 minutes before simply walking off stage and disappearing, leaving the audience and his management team baffled and concerned. A third group maintained that Tony had never appeared on stage at all, that they had waited for 2 hours in the darkened hall before being told that the performer had suffered a medical emergency and the concert was cancelled. But perhaps most unsettling were the accounts of those who claimed that Tony had performed the entire evening as planned, singing for nearly 3 hours, giving encores, taking curtain calls, and showing no signs of distress or unusual behavior. According to these witnesses, the concert had been one of Tony's finest performances, with no mysterious countdowns, no conversations with dead girlfriends, and no supernatural elements whatsoever. The only point on which all 2,738 audience members agreed was that they had experienced something profoundly moving and transformative that night, something that had changed their understanding of music, mortality, and the thin boundary between performance and reality. Patricia Williams, Tony's longtime manager, provided perhaps the most puzzling testimony of all. According to her account, she had been standing in the wings throughout the entire performance, watching Tony sing to a completely empty auditorium. From her vantage point, the David Geffen Hall had been vacant. No audience, no Dr. Chen, no mysterious woman in seat A1. Tony performed for 2 hours to empty seats, Patricia told investigators, tears streaming down her face. But he sang with more passion and connection than I had ever seen from him. It was as if he could see and hear thousands of people who simply weren't there. He was having conversations with the audience, responding to applause that I couldn't hear, telling stories to people who didn't exist. Patricia's account was corroborated by other backstage personnel, including sound engineers and lighting technicians, all of whom reported that the hall had been empty throughout the evening. But their equipment had registered something extraordinary. Acoustic patterns suggesting the presence of a large, responsive audience, with applause, laughter, and even vocal responses that appeared on their recordings, despite no visible source. The recordings themselves became another source of controversy. Digital audio files from that night contained Tony's performance, clearly audible and beautifully rendered. But scattered throughout the recordings were sounds that shouldn't have been possible. Audience responses that seemed to come from a different time period, using applause patterns and vocal expressions that experts identified as typical of 1940s and 1950s audiences rather than contemporary crowds. Most mysteriously embedded in the audio at seemingly random intervals were fragments of conversations in Italian, spoken by voices that sounded decades old. Translation revealed these to be comments about Tony's performance, but delivered by people discussing him as young Anthony, rather than the elderly legend he had become. But the physical evidence provided perhaps the most compelling mystery of all. Security cameras in the hallways outside the David Geffen Hall captured something that defied explanation. Footage of audience members entering the venue throughout the evening, but no corresponding footage of anyone leaving. More than 2,700 people were recorded arriving at Lincoln Center that night, but the exit cameras showed fewer than 50 departures. The remainder seemed to have vanished inside the building, leaving no trace except for their testimonies about Tony's performance and their insistence that they had attended one of the most remarkable concerts of their lives. The investigation into Tony Bennett's final Lincoln Center performance was quietly closed after 6 months, with authorities unable to explain the contradictory evidence or the impossible logistics of that evening. The official report listed the event as a routine concert performance with minor technical difficulties, but internal documents revealed the investigators' bafflement and concern about the unexplained phenomena. Tony himself provided no clarity about what had actually happened that night. When questioned by investigators, journalists, and curious fans, he would smile gently and say only that he had sung the songs that needed to be sung for the people who needed to hear them. When pressed for more details, Tony would add, "Sometimes music takes us places that can't be mapped or measured. Sometimes a performance becomes something larger than entertainment. I'm grateful that I was able to experience that, whatever it was." But privately, according to those closest to him, Tony seemed profoundly changed by the experience. He spoke often about feeling lighter, as if some burden he had carried for decades had finally been lifted from his shoulders. He mentioned dreams about conversations with people from his past, and he expressed a sense of peace about his legacy and his mortality that surprised those who had known him as someone who struggled with the inevitable changes that came with aging. 6 months after the Lincoln Center performance, Tony Bennett died peacefully in his sleep at his Manhattan apartment. Susan found him in his favorite chair, holding a handwritten note that he had apparently composed during his final hours. The note read, "The countdown is over, and the choice has been made. I hope I chose well. Thank you for listening to the music. Thank you for helping me understand that love never really ends. It just changes from one form to another, from one voice to another, from one heart to another. Keep singing, keep listening, keep believing that every ending is also a beginning. A.B." The note was written in handwriting that experts confirmed was Tony's, but ink analysis revealed something impossible. The paper and ink dated to 1947. Tony Bennett's funeral was attended by thousands of mourners, including many who claimed to have been present at his final Lincoln Center concert. But investigators found something impossible. The people who attended the funeral were different from those who had witnessed the mysterious performance, as if two separate groups of mourners existed in parallel. In the years following Tony's death, the David Geffen Hall began experiencing what staff described as acoustic anomalies. On quiet evenings, security guards reported hearing faint music from the main auditorium. Specifically, Tony Bennett's voice performing songs from his final concert, accompanied by audience applause from decades past. Margaret Torino's existence remained one of the most intriguing mysteries. Extensive research revealed no record of anyone by that name in Tony's life from the 1940s. But in a small, upstate cemetery, researchers found a grave for Margaret Rose Torino, dated 1947, with weekly fresh flowers despite no records of who maintained it. The mystery of Tony Bennett's final performance became the subject of numerous books and documentaries. Some investigators proposed that Tony had experienced a complex hallucination. Others suggested the entire event had been an elaborate staged performance. But perhaps the most compelling theory came from Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a professor of musicology at Columbia University. What happened to Tony Bennett that night, Dr. Rodriguez wrote, may have been the ultimate expression of something that happens to great performers near the end of their careers. They begin to exist in multiple time periods connected to every audience they have ever performed for. According to Dr. Rodriguez's theory, Tony's countdown performance had been his conscious participation in this phenomenon, his choice to step outside linear time and experience his artistic legacy all at once. Tony Bennett didn't just perform for the audience that was physically present that night, Dr. Rodriguez concluded. He performed for every audience he had ever sung for. The countdown wasn't measuring time until his death. It was measuring time until his transformation from a living performer into an eternal presence in the world of music. Whether Dr. Rodriguez's theory was correct would remain a matter of speculation and wonder. But what was certain was that the music continued, carrying forward the voices of those who had found courage to sing and believe that some songs transcend the boundaries between life and death. And sometimes on quiet evenings at Lincoln Center, staff members still report hearing faint applause and the distant echo of a voice singing. Not as a performance, but as a promise that the music never really ends. It just waits patiently for the next person who needs to hear it.